Right, so we're chapter 3, energy and ecosystems. This will be our focus for lecture 2. So in your textbook, the accompanying reading, right, section 1, pages 46 through 49, just kind of goes through some, really actually just some basic terminology for you guys. There's just some vocab you need to accumulate. I'll briefly address some of that simpler vocab in this slideshow, but you guys are definitely going to want to follow up with some reading and kind of get some notes on those. But I'll point out at least what those definite terms you want to know are. And then part of the energy section, maybe you guys already read, pages 52 through 53, that's where the book discusses photosynthesis, cellular respiration, and what's called chemosynthesis. All right. So definitely follow up this slideshow with a little reading and note taking. Okay. So we are essentially starting a unit on ecology, right? So we spent some time discussing energy, in class and in the entropy lab and stuff. And so that was our fundamental. What we're going to focus on in this chapter is essentially how energy works its way through ecosystems, all right? But when we talk about the term ecology in the first place, it's a really broad field. It's actually the broadest field in biology, okay? So ecology is the study of interactions among organisms, so the living things, right, in their abiotic environment, right? Some cliche biology terms. Any biology class, you're going to need to know the difference between biotic and abiotic, okay? So biotic refers to the living environment. So we're talking anything from bacteria and fungus all the way up through really complex mammals and plants, all right? So anything living, all right? And how those living things interact with the non-living parts. So how do they use water, for example? What kind of soil nutrients are needed for the plants? How does it interact with the climate? Okay, the soil nutrients, the water, the climate, the space. Those are all abiotic, or the non-living parts of the environment that are equally important. So ecology looks at that interface, that interaction between those organisms living in an environment, how they interact between themselves, other living things, but also that non-living or abiotic component. All right? And so in the world of biology, very big world, it's actually really well organized, the various fields, right? So we get down to the atom and molecule phase right there, and we're actually looking at a field called biochemistry, which is kind of an overlap of the biology world with chemistry. They start looking at what they call biomacromolecules and the building blocks of life, right? Then we come up here into what they call cellular biology, right? Where we're looking at the interactions between different organelles in the cell and what's actually going on at a microscopic level. And then we work our way up to cells into tissues, the various parts of an individual organism, the construction of bones and muscle tissues and the various organs, all right? So those would be, botanists, so for example, would study, the various parts of a plant, okay? So there's several fields in biology dealing with cells and tissues, right? Then we get up into our body systems, right? And up to individual organisms, right? So we start building bigger and bigger, and not necessarily more or less complex as you go up. We get pretty complex down here, even just in a single cell, but that's a discussion for when you guys take AP Bio or something like that. In ecology, right, the field of biology that we're going to focus on in environmental science, at least for the most part, we're really looking at anything past that organism level, right? So we're looking at interactions between organisms. So anything from here up. So we can look at individual populations, we can look at communities and ecosystems, we can look at much larger portions of ecosystems we call landscapes or biomes, right? All the way up to the entire biosphere. All right? So ecology we use that as our kind of defining line. Studies everything from beyond the individual organism. All right? Other fields of biology also very interesting, just not so much the scope of environmental science, at least not in what we're going to talk about, okay? So, some key terms in ecology. We need to know what a species is versus a population, versus a community, versus an ecosystem, landscape, and biosphere, all right? So, we're essentially, as you go up in these terms, we're talking about a smaller and smaller group, all right? It's probably the best way to put that. And so there's essentially one page in your textbook where you can go through and define these. But a species, right? You know, there's some gray area there. Most biologists, or most biology teachers at least, would define a species as a group of organisms that can freely interbreed and have viable offspring. And so maybe you know, a common example of that would be, let's say we have a horse and a donkey. All right. Now, a horse and a donkey are closely related, but they are not considered the same species, at least by most definitions of species. And the reason for that is a horse and a donkey can interbreed and have offspring. We call that a mule, right? You guys have heard of mules before. But in the vast majority of cases, mules are sterile. Mules cannot then reproduce with other mules, right? You know, there are some kind of bizarre cases where a mule can have offspring, like with a horse or something like that. But for the most part, if a horse and a donkey have offspring, that's a mule, and mules, for the most part, are sterile and cannot have offspring. All right. So therefore, we say that a horse and a donkey are actually separate species. Okay, even though they're closely related. And so there is some gray area there, because we start getting things like subspecies, where some organisms, some can interbreed, and it's difficult, especially as populations are essentially changing over time. All right. Next step up there is a population. Right. So a population is a group of the same species. All right. Whoops. So typically we're talking about, in a given geographic area, a group of the same species is what we refer to as a population. So in your classroom, right, we have a population of humans, right, or Homo sapiens, I guess would be the biology term for that. All right. Now, as we go from population to a community, we're getting to the biotic components of an ecosystem, right? So all the living things in a geographic area are what we call the community. So population refers to one single species. A community refers to all the different species in a given area. We go one step up to ecosystem, and we're talking about biotic plus abiotic components. Okay? So we're looking at all the living organisms plus the abiotic components like sunlight and soil nutrients, etc. All right. Now we can jump up to then landscape, which is essentially taking a larger snapshot, so a much larger geographic area, which might contain several ecosystems. So, for example, you could have, you know, a stream and a forest and some you know, alpine meadows, all kind of in a mountainous area, for example. And you'd have several different ecosystems. The nutrients are going to be different. The amount of sunlight is going to be different. The amount of water available will be a little different. So in your alpine landscape, you can have several different ecosystems. All right, and then all the way up to what we call our biosphere. The biosphere takes us to anywhere there are living organisms. All right, so we can find living organisms in three parts of the Earth. Right, we have the atmosphere. You should all know what the atmosphere is, right? That's the gases that surround our planet, mostly nitrogen and oxygen. All right, hydrosphere is the water. Okay, so oceans, etc. And the lithosphere refers to the portion of the Earth's crust, right, and part of the upper mantle, actually, that support life. So essentially, they're very top layers. Okay, You go down very deep and we don't really see any more organisms. But biosphere is kind of at that intersection between the lithosphere, atmosphere, and hydrosphere where we find living organisms. All right? And so that's kind of the biggest scope of ecology would zone out essentially on the entire planet and where we find life. And there are some interactions. Even if we look in, there's that whole, you've heard maybe of the butterfly effect, right? How, a butterfly in Brazil could cause a tornado in Texas, There's all these little interactions that occur that kind of ripple out. It'd have to be a really big butterfly, as it turns out. But point being, there are interactions. Things that occur here in Walla Walla could eventually ripple out and affect something that's occurring on the other side of the planet. And so the field of ecology does try to take kind of a global perspective when it's appropriate. All right. So back now to energy. All right, so we set the scope for what ecology is. We set some key terminology. The primary focus of Chapter 3, though, is how does energy work its way into ecosystems? All right, and what are some fundamentals for that? So probably the most important process to us when it comes to getting energy into living organisms is this process of photosynthesis. Now, most of you are going to have a fairly good idea for what photosynthesis means. It should have come up in your middle school science, and if you took just regular freshman science, you should have got this as well. But it's a biological process. So this is done by living things, primarily plants. Okay, and what plants do, and also some algae, is they use sunlight. Okay, so and again, they're not eating sunlight. They're using energy from sunlight to create their own food, all right, from things like carbon dioxide and water, right? So plants capture energy from sunlight. They use that energy, right? So that's their energy input, right, to essentially build molecules of sugar from carbon dioxide and water. So here's the formula you're typically going to see, all right? So in order for photosynthesis to occur, traditional photosynthesis, we have an input of carbon dioxide. So plants have little structures called stomata in their leaves, right? And the stomata are essentially how the plants take a breath in. They inhale, for lack of a better term, air, and part of that air is carbon dioxide. Okay? They also take in some water. We should all know that all plants do require some water, right? And the water is actually brought up through capillary action through their roots. Okay? And then they bring in radiant energy, which is typically going to be sunlight. Is that radiant energy? Okay. Now they have structures called chloroplasts, right? And chloroplasts are actually organelles in plant cells that allow that capturing. So they're not like capturing sunlight. The chloroplasts allow the absorption of certain wavelengths of light as the energy input needed to then combine carbon dioxide and water to create food for themselves, right? And so typically we write photosynthesis as the creation of glucose, all right? This is an oversimplification. We're not cellular biology in this class. So we're going to keep this simple. Carbon dioxide and water, right? Carbon dioxide from the air, from the atmosphere, water from the soil, right? Get brought into a plant. And the plants then use certain wavelengths of light to reassemble the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen found in carbon dioxide and water to build sugar molecules like glucose. Okay? Now, glucose is a carbohydrate, and there's chemical energy stored in that. All right? Now, in the process of creating this glucose, some of the byproducts are water again, right? So about half of the water taken in is put into our glucose molecule. About half of the water becomes waste, all right? And plants actually breathe that out to the air. It's called evapotranspiration, by the way, right? And another byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen, free oxygen, which is actually relatively rare in the universe, but that's beside the point, okay? And so essentially, during photosynthesis, plants breathe in carbon dioxide and exhale water vapor and oxygen. the carbon dioxide and water brought into the plant are reassembled. So they're broken down and reassembled to form glucose. Now, glucose is the food. All right? So plants use the process of photosynthesis to essentially assemble their own food. Then the plants actually use that glucose for themselves, okay, in a process called cellular respiration. All right? Now, anything that's not a producer gets its energy from the process of cellular respiration. All right? In fact, producers also use cellular respiration after they go through photosynthesis. All right? So the chemical energy captured during photosynthesis is then released within the cells of plants and animals. And this is a big misconception. Okay? Plants don't create the glucose for other organisms. They create the glucose for themselves. Right? There's the energy stored there that they can then grow and reproduce and repair damaged tissues. Right? So plants and animals go through that process of photosynthesis, or cellular respiration, not just animals and other consumers. Okay? Now, cellular respiration formula looks like, or photosynthesis begins with carbon dioxide and water, creates glucose, water, and oxygen. Interestingly, cellular respiration is the reverse of that process. Okay? Notice, here's our glucose that we created during photosynthesis. Here's the water and oxygen that were also byproducts of photosynthesis. So essentially, these were waste products during photosynthesis, but all consumers, right, and the plants themselves then use the glucose for energy, combined with some oxygen and water to be part of that reaction to create CO2, water, and of course the energy they need for things like creating new cells, reproduction, movement, growth, etc. Okay? And these are very, very fundamental processes in biology, all right? This is textbook energy for ecosystems, and this is kind of, we'll talk about how entropy and stuff fit in to this process here in the next lesson, but we kind of have to understand this. And so we have an intersection of matter and energy. All right? So the matter here, right, that's important to us are these little bits, the inputs and outputs, okay, of photosynthesis and respiration, which are actually the same materials, right? So if I was to flip-flop my reactants and products, I'd have photosynthesis, right? So cellular respiration is essentially the reverse of photosynthesis. All right, so we have this matter that just gets cycled in and out of the atmosphere, in and out of the soil, right? And then brought back in through photosynthesis. So photosynthesis brings carbon and hydrogen and oxygen into living systems. Respiration returns it back to the environment. Okay? And all of this is done so that the organisms can access the chemical energy in molecules. So energy stored in the molecules of, again, glucose is going to be kind of our generic sugar molecule. We create all kinds of things like proteins and lipids and stuff like that too. But our bodies break things down, and in your mitochondria, and there's all kinds of crazy complex cellular processes that occur. We're going to keep it simple, okay? So your job is to know the inputs and outputs of photosynthesis, right? So these are my inputs, outputs, okay? And then know that that's essentially reversed for cellular respiration, all right? So energy works its way in to living organisms, originally as sunlight, right? Photosynthesis uses the energy from sunlight to create things like glucose, right? And then that glucose is then used by plants, or whatever eats the plants, or whatever eats the organism that eats the plants. It goes up through the food chain. During that, we're essentially returning the carbon, the hydrogen, and the oxygen back to the atmosphere or the soil, at which point it could then be brought back into living organisms. We have this cycle of matter. All right? Now, the book also talks about the interesting case where if we go deep down in the ocean, all right, where no light actually penetrates, we still find some organisms, and they tend to cluster around these little, what they call hydrothermal vents, right? These are places in the Earth's crust where some of the deep down heat and chemicals escape, right? So we have these, they're called hydrothermal vents because warm water is squirted out through these kind of openings in the crust. It's related to volcanic activity and plate tectonics, really. Okay? But these kind of blackish looking water here is actually filled with hydrogen sulfide. All right? And so we have an interesting situation here where they're not plants, right? They're strange little, what they call archaea bacteria, where instead of using sunlight as the primary source of energy to kickstart the energy into living systems, they use what's called chemosynthesis, in which case they're taking things like hydrogen sulfide, using the energy in hydrogen sulfide to then bring energy into living systems, right? So it's a totally different type of ecosystem where instead of sunlight being the original source of energy, it is chemicals from the Earth's interior, the original source of energy, all right? And we have these actually very vibrant ecosystems deep down in the ocean where it's really cold and really dark because of these chemosynthesizers. And so organisms can support an entire food chain of organisms. Pretty cool. All right? That's it for today.